Good morning, bonjour et merci de vous joindre à moi aujourd'hui. Je suis Jerry DeMarco, le commissaire à l'environnement et au développement durable du Canada. Je tiens d'abord à reconnaître que nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. Ce territoire accueille de nombreux autres peuples de Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis, et je reconnais et apprécie également leur contribution. I am here today to discuss 5 reports that we provided to Parliament this morning. Our first report is on the Zero Plastic Waste Initiative. We found that the federal government did not know whether its reduction activities would eliminate all plastic waste by 2030. Although the initiative refers to zero plastic waste, its targets refer only to reducing plastic waste and are not measuring against the end goal of zero plastic waste. It is an important distinction that needs to be reflected in the initiative's reporting so that Canadians and parliamentarians can see how much progress is being made towards eliminating plastic waste. La bonne nouvelle, c'est que nous avons constaté que les activités de réduction des déchets découlant de l'initiative produisent de bons résultats et concordent étroitement avec les priorités du Canada. Par exemple, Pêche et Océan Canada avait financé 67 projets visant à retirer des eaux des engins de pêche abandonnés, perdus ou rejetés. Toutefois, les organisations n'avaient pas l'information nécessaire pour pouvoir montrer comment leurs efforts contribuent à atteindre l'objectif pan-canadien. Par exemple, il y a un délai de 3 ans dans la publication des données de Statistique Canada sur les déchets de plastique rejetés dans l'environnement. Pour réduire la pollution par le plastique, le gouvernement fédéral doit collaborer avec de nombreuses parties, dont la province, le territoire, les municipalités et le secteur privé. Avec autant de partenaires, il est particulièrement important de disposer de systèmes de suivi rigoureux. Our next audit examined contaminated sites in northern Canada, which continue to carry significant health, environmental, and financial risks. We found that Transport Canada and Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, which manage many of these sites, complied with the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan. However, this was not enough for the program to meet its objectives of reducing the health, environmental, and financial risks associated with these sites. The Canada-wide financial liability for known federal contaminated sites has increased from $2.9 billion to $10.1 billion since the launch of the action plan in 2005. While only 11% of the sites are in the north, over 60% of Canada's total estimated financial liability is linked to the remediation of northern sites. This is an enormous financial burden on taxpayers and represents a failure to properly implement the polluter pays principle, as many private sector sites had to be taken over by the federal government. Après 20 ans, il reste encore beaucoup à faire pour réduire les coûts associés aux sites contaminés et atténuer les risques pour l'environnement et la santé humaine, dans l'intérêt de générations actuelles et futures. Le gouvernement doit prendre d'urgence des mesures pour favoriser les avantages socio-économiques, notamment les occasions d'emploi, et soutenir la réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones dont les terres sont souvent touchées par les sites contaminés. Je vais passer maintenant aux 3 derniers rapports qui portent sur des mesures de lutte contre les changements climatiques. Nos récents rapports ont examiné les 2 plus grands secteurs émetteurs. Cette année, nous avons examiné d'autres grandes sources d'émissions, à savoir les matériaux de construction, les industries manufacturières et l'agriculture. Dans tous ces audits, nous avons constaté de lents progrès, ainsi que l'absence d'approche à long terme pour réduire les émissions. Ces constats ne diminuent toutefois pas le potentiel que présentent ces mesures pour aider le Canada à atteindre la carboneutralité, à condition qu'elle soit conçue et mise en œuvre de manière plus efficace. Notre audit de l'écologisation des matériaux de construction dans les infrastructures publiques a révélé que le passage aux matériaux de construction à faible teneur en carbone avait été trop lent, compte tenu de l'urgence de la crise des changements climatiques. Though the federal government first expressed in 2006 its desire to move markets towards goods and services that carry a lower carbon footprint, it took more than 10 years for it to consider the use of low-carbon construction materials, and it was only in late 2022 that the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat established the standard on embodied carbon in construction. As of now, the standard applies only to ready-mix concrete. We also found that Public Services and Procurement Canada had not finished incorporating the requirements of the standard into its infrastructure procurement process. Meanwhile, Infrastructure Canada has incorporated considerations related to reducing the carbon content of construction materials into its funding programs only in a limited way. This is important because emissions from construction and construction materials account for 11% of Canada's total emissions. This slow pace of change is concerning because steel production typically emits high amounts of greenhouse gases and is widely used in major construction projects. To increase Canada's chances of meeting its 2030 and 2050 climate commitments, the federal government needs to more actively promote the use of low-carbon construction materials in public infrastructure. Notre prochain audit a porté sur l'initiative Accélérateur Net Zero, qui vise à réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre en incitant les industries canadiennes à décarboner leurs activités. Nous avons constaté qu'Innovation, Sciences et Développement économique Canada n'avait pas réussi à attirer les plus grands émetteurs industriels du pays. Sur les 55 entreprises ayant produit le plus d'émissions, seulement 15 avaient présenté une demande de financement en vertu de l'initiative, et seulement 2 d'entre elles avaient signé un accord de contribution. Le long et complexe processus de demande, qui exige en moyenne 407 heures, n'a sans doute pas aidé le ministère à attirer un plus grand nombre de demandeurs. Nous avons aussi constaté que le ministère ne savait pas toujours combien de réductions d'émissions la plupart des entreprises participant à l'initiative réaliseraient, ou si le financement accordé entraînerait une réduction d'émissions. Surprisingly, there is no overarching industrial decarbonization policy to provide Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada with a clear picture of which industries are most in need of funds to reduce emissions. I am concerned about what the department plans to do to address the significant gaps uncovered in our audit, given the vague responses it provided to our recommendations. Our last audit looked at agriculture and climate change mitigation. We found that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada had not developed a strategy for how the agriculture sector would contribute to Canada's 2030 and 2050 climate goals, despite a strategy being first called for in 2020. In 2021, the department launched 3 key programs aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, delays in funding approvals resulted in recipients missing a growing season. The department has so far achieved less than 2% of its 2030 overall greenhouse gas reduction target. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada will need to ensure that all expected reductions in greenhouse gas emissions for 2030 take place in the 6 growing seasons that remain. Nous avons aussi constaté qu'Agriculture et Agroalimentaire Canada n'avait pas encore défini des cibles de rendement pour 2 des 3 programmes, ce qui rend difficile l'évaluation des progrès. La contribution du ministère à la réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre est indispensable dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques, d'où l'importance de fixer des objectifs et de surveiller les résultats. Malgré les résultats limités rapportés jusqu'à présent, toutes ces initiatives climatiques pourraient, si elles sont améliorées, contribuer à l'atteinte de la carboneutralité d'ici 2050 et à la réalisation de changements importants pour les générations actuelles et futures. Given the ongoing climate crisis and the federal government's repeated struggles to achieve real emission reductions, a strategic, coherent, results-oriented approach is essential if Canada is to play its part in the global fight against climate change. Thank you. I am now ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we'll start with questions in the room, and then we'll move to people who are participating online on Zoom. If you have a question and you're participating on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. So I know that you want to ask a question, and I'll get to you just after we've worked our way through the folks that are here in person. Okay, Alessia Pasafume from the Canadian Press. Go ahead.
Hi. So your report on the North says that Indigenous peoples were expressing concern with the federal government's handling of projects, saying that there's been a lack of meaningful engagement, consultation, and consideration of their inputs. Can you expand a little bit more about what you heard from the communities?
Yes, so I can't speak for the communities, but I can tell you what we've heard from the communities. And it's a question of environmental justice in some sense, because these communities have absorbed the health and environmental effects of these contaminated sites. And now that considerable funds are going to remediate the sites, it seems fair that they should benefit from the economic and social opportunities arising from the cleanups. So we heard from the communities that there's been a lack of meaningful engagement in the process, that they have not seen as many of the benefits associated with the cleanups, including employment opportunities, for example, and that they don't necessarily have the capacity to engage in all of these processes without capacity building efforts being made by the federal government. So those are some of the things we heard from the communities. And as I mentioned, I don't speak for those communities, but I do set out in the report some of the key points that they made to our audit team in conducting this engagement.
And on plastics, StatsCan's monitoring is about 3 years behind. What do they need to do to change this?
So we found this with several areas of environmental endeavor, climate change related greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lack of prompt reporting on the magnitude of emissions in Canada. And with plastic waste, we saw that it was even slower. So we just received in the last couple of weeks the latest report from Stats Canada, and it goes for 3 years ago in terms of it goes to 3 years ago in terms of the data contained in that report. So Stats Canada needs to prioritize the importance of environmental indicators like plastic waste and so on. If Canada is serious about dealing with what the UN calls the triple planetary threat of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, including plastic waste, then we need more real-time data on how significant the problem is and how well we're doing in addressing those problems.
Thank you. David Thurton, CBC News. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Commissioner. I wanted to focus on the Net Zero Accelerator program. You found that $8 billion fund failed to attract many big emitters as it set out to do. There was also problems with the emissions accounting and other accounting measures. So how would you describe the success of this $8 billion program where much of the funds have been allocated? Would you go so far as to say that it was a failure?
So it's had limited success. 6.2 megatons is all that we could account for in terms of bankable reductions from the over $3 billion in contribution agreements that have been signed so far. So it's an $8 billion fund, but over $3 billion has been the subject of 17 contribution agreements. If you add up all the reductions that are committed to in those 17 agreements, you'll find that only 5 of them actually have commitments to reductions, and they add up to just over 6 megatons. So it's a very large outlay of taxpayer dollars for what I would say is relatively limited results in terms of 6 megatons. To put it in perspective, 6 megatons is less than 1% of total emissions in Canada. So they really do need to attract the large emitters to get more bang for their buck in the remaining funds that they have left in the $8 billion total.
And can you explain to me why do you think that this program had this limited success? Is the blame to be put on the way that the government designed it? Is the blame to be put maybe on big industry in Canada? Are they just not interested in applying for money that could reduce their emissions? Do they not take climate change that seriously?
So we're auditing the performance of the government department in this case. So I would say that if they're trying to make a significant contribution to Canada's overall greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2030 and for 2050, it's up to them to design the program in a way that appeals to those large emitters, because that's where they're going to get the largest reductions. It's simple enough to dole out money, but you need to do it in a way that creates value for money for taxpayers, because ultimately it's taxpayers who are paying this money that's being transferred to select industries. So the failure, I would say, is the primary failure is for them to closely track the amount of emissions they're getting for each dollar they're spending, and the other failure would be their inability to really attract most of the large emitters where you could get the most significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Those would be the two that I would point out as the most problematic aspects of this audit.
Julie Pleurd, Radio-Canada. Julie, you there? Julie Pleurd, Radio-Canada, do you have a question? Okay. Denis Lord, Tir Media. Do you have a question, Denis?
Oui, bonjour monsieur, Denis Laure. Donc, j'aimerais savoir à quel point on peut faire confiance à la fermeture effective des sites, ceux qui sont déclarés fermés. Est-ce qu'on peut vraiment croire, est-ce que le public canadien peut vraiment croire que ces sites-là auraient dû être fermés?
Avec les sites contaminés au nord du Canada, il y a de bonnes nouvelles. Il y a beaucoup de sites qui sont fermés. Et oui, on a trouvé qu'il y a des problèmes avec la documentation avec quelques sites qui sont fermés. Est-ce que je peux dire que tous les sites fermés ont éliminé tous les risques avec l'environnement et la santé humaine? Non, je ne peux pas dire que je suis certain que tout, parce qu'on a trouvé des exemples où la documentation était incomplète. Alors, nous avons fait des recommandations pour que le ministère puisse adresser ces lacunes et être certain que les sites qui sont fermés sont sains et saufs.
Est-ce que j'ai le droit à une autre question? Oui. Si on comprend, si j'ai bien compris le rapport, plus on assainit lentement les sites, plus le passif financier augmente.
Où le passif financier augmente dans une manière significative?
Oui, par rapport, je parle aux sites contaminés dans le Nord.
Alors, les exemples que nous avons dans notre rapport, il y a deux sites que je peux... Il y a deux sites qui contribuent le plus au passif financier, qui augmente de environ 3 milliards de dollars jusqu'à maintenant plus de 10 milliards de dollars. Et ça, c'est le mine Giant au territoire du Nord-Ouest et le mine Ferro dans le Yukon. Ça, c'est les deux exemples avec où sont le passif financier est très significatif. de centaines de millions de dollars, de milliards de dollars.
Merci à vous.
OK. Julie, Radio-Canada, avez-vous une question? Non. OK. Zian Lum, Politico. Do you have a question? Zian,
Hello, sorry.
do you have
Hi.
a question?
Is it working? I don't have a question.
Okay.
Sorry, my hand wasn't raised.
Okay, I'm sorry. Forget it. All right. Are there any other questions in the room? Yeah, Alessia?
Back to plastics, can you explain how you chose the 16 programs in the report?
So we decided to look at this initiative relatively early on in the hopes that we could provide recommendations that would help them attain their ambitious goal of zero plastic waste by 2030. So we selected, amongst the many initiatives, we selected ones that essentially had some runway already, that they were getting going or were about to get going. And we found that of the 16, 11 had begun achieving positive results, and they're set out in Exhibit 3.4. And then 5 of the other ones were more in the preliminary stages. We also wanted to get a range of different responsible departments rather than just doing all initiatives that were headed by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we also chose a sample that included other departments like Fisheries and Oceans Canada with their Ghost Gear program, Statistics Canada, and CERNAC in the north.
Yeah, sure. So on agriculture now, are you surprised that Agriculture Canada still has not created a strategy to meet the emissions reduction targets? And how significant is this problem in monitoring the progress towards those targets?
Yes, I'm surprised and disappointed that after being asked by the Centre of Government for a strategy in 2020 that we're sitting here in 2024 and we still don't see the strategy, and we've had to make a recommendation in our report again asking Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to create the strategy that government itself asked it for back 4 years ago. And the absence of a strategy is quite problematic because the strategy could provide a pathway for the department to reach its target of 11 megatons of greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. It wouldn't be such a problem if we saw that the programs were making strong headway already in the absence of a strategy, but we see in our report that there's less than 1 megaton of reduction so far. So that's less than 2% of their target that they've achieved so far simply by rolling out programs in the absence of a strategy. So they're definitely doing work. They're carrying out these programs, but there's no coherent strategy that says, for example, how they're going to reach their methane reduction targets, how they're going to address fertilizer, and how it all comes together in a coherent way. And as I said, if they're only at the point of achieving 2% of their reductions, and there's only between now and 2030 to get the remainder of them, a strategy that creates a pathway and performance target measurement system to get to that, to get to 2030 is desperately needed for agriculture to play its part, for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to play its part in the whole of government plan to address climate change and to reduce emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030.
Okay, we have a question from Nelly, Radio-Canada. Okay, vas-y.
Bonjour, ma question est donc en français et porte sur le rapport numéro 2 concernant les bâtiments et la décarbonation des bâtiments publics. Si je comprends bien, le gouvernement donc a bien fait des efforts pour améliorer les infrastructures, mais clairement un peu tard, il est très lent là-dessus. Est-ce que ça signifie qu'on va pas atteindre nos objectifs de 2030 ou est-ce que c'est encore possible si on met vraiment, on accélère vraiment la mise en place de nouveaux objectifs?
Oui, alors ils ont fait des progrès récemment, mais ils sont lents à joindre l'effort de décarboniser l'infrastructure et particulièrement avec l'acier. Alors, ils ont une norme pour le béton, mais ils n'ont pas encore une norme pour l'acier. Et ça, c'est un matériel qui a une grand effet sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Alors, j'espère qu'ils vont accélérer leurs efforts et ajouter l'acier aux normes sur le matériau à faible teneur de carbone.
I'm going to try Julie from Radio-Canada again. Julie, avez-vous une question? À vous la parole.
Hear me?
Oui, vas-y.
Oh, finally, I'm very sorry about that. I'm going to ask a question in English and then I'll follow with one in French. My first question, Commissioner, is you mentioned in the report on contaminated sites that there's a lack of reporting and meaningful information on these sites. Can you explain why? And I'm wondering, is it because like those sites are in remote area? I'm talking about Giant and Barrow, where there's not a whole lot of attention towards these sites. They're in northern Canada. Is there a reason why Canadians are not getting more information about these sites?
Thank you for the question and your persistence in getting the audio to work. Essentially, the issue with transparency and quality of reporting is that the inventory has not been updated in the many years since it was created. So the contaminated sites inventory from Treasury Board was created many years ago, and they've not updated it to modernize it, to make it searchable, to make it more transparent. So it's a question of essentially the will to update that inventory and the resources needed for the expenditures required to do that. It's certainly possible in terms of the underlying data that they have. They could make the inventory much more transparent and accessible to Canadians. It's not a question that there's a lack of knowledge of all of these sites. They have the information that they need to make that transparent. It's just a question of will.
Okay, thank you. Et en français, on remarque une hausse très importante des coûts associés au nettoyage de ces sites contaminés. Pouvez-vous expliquer pourquoi c'est beaucoup plus cher, de 2 milliards à plus de 10 milliards là, sur 20 ans? Qu'est-ce qui explique cette très grande hausse des coûts?
Alors, le passif financier a augmenté de à peu près 3 milliards jusqu'à maintenant plus de 10 milliards. C'est pas tout de mauvaises nouvelles parce que ça, c'est pas la première fois qu'on a un audit sur ce sujet. Un de nos autres audits a recommandé qu'il fait plus d'analyses, plus de recherches sur des sites qui n'étaient pas identifiés jusqu'à ce moment. Alors, ils ont fait plus de recherches, ils ont trouvé de nouveaux sites et ça, c'est pas un problème. C'est un problème avec le passif financier, mais c'est mieux qu'on sait où sont ces sites au lieu de ne savoir rien sur ces sites. Alors, ça, c'est une partie de la portrait qu'il sait plus d'informations, ils ont plus d'un sens géographique de la magnitude de la problème et avec ça, le passif financier augmente. Mais ce n'est pas la seule raison. Le progrès avec quelques sites, c'est très lent et le plus lent que le progrès, le plus cher que ça va être pour décontaminer le site. Et ça, c'est une autre raison. Dans notre rapport, nous avons un sommaire il y a 5 ou 6 différentes raisons pour l'augmentation du passif financier en ce qui concerne les sites contaminés au nord.
Okay. David Thurton, did you want to ask another question? Okay. All right. So that concludes today's press conference. Thank you so much to Commissioner DeMarco. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, sir.